Well, hello, all you good listeners to futureprimitive.org. We are back for talk number 4, John Lash and Joanna Harcourt-Smith. This one is called the Psychonautic Adventure and the Path of Coevolution. So, I spoke about one of my latest adventures in the Psychonautic Adventure, which was last year when I went to Huautla in Mexico, in the Mazatec Mountains, and it was quite extraordinary because my visit there coincided with the 50th anniversary of the first time that Gordon Wasson was there and experienced the mushroom journey with Maria Sabina. So I'm going to ask John to define the term psychonaut.
Well, that's a good place to start, because if we're going to talk about the Psychonautic Adventure, we need to know what psychonauts are. And of course the word is easy to analyze. Psycho is from psyche, meaning the mind, soul, or imagination. The animated part of every living creature is the psyche. And naut means someone who navigates, a sailor, a voyager, a pathfinder. So a psychonaut is someone who travels in the realms of the psyche. And you might also call such a person an entheonaut, because this word entheogen has been introduced, and we'll explain, or we'll discuss a little bit later, why the term entheogen was brought into use, and as opposed to the term psychedelic, which you and I are both quite familiar with, having been baptized in the Great Revolution of the 60s. So I just want to point out one thing before we talk about what the adventure is. When we think about psychonauts and wonder who the great psychonauts of the 20th century were, for instance, the word, by the way, was introduced by a man called Ernst Junger. We need to understand perhaps who these people were by names, like Alan Watts, for instance, and by example, and by the way that they handled the psychonautic experience, we can learn from their example. But it's important to bear in mind that the psychonautic experience, the psychedelic experience, if you want to call it that, is not a journey inward. It's often been described in this way, and I'd like to point out that I think that description is misleading. The psyche, in fact, in my understanding, is not something inside us. It's more like something that we are inside. Just think about that. You are inside your own psyche. You're inside your psyche like the pupa of a butterfly is inside a cocoon. And the psyche that surrounds you is the medium of transformation in which you grow and evolve. So, my conception of exploring the psyche does not mean we shut our eyes and we go inside to some mysterious inner space. There is no inner space. There is just space. There is the space of matter and the space without matter. And the journey of the psychonaut is as much going out as it is going in. Certainly it does produce certain insights and realizations when we look into ourselves. But the essence of the journey, I believe, is to go outward into nature and into the soul of the world and explore nature and the mysterious, miraculous life of nature, which is the matrix of where we come from. So as we talk more about this adventure, I think it will become clear that it isn't not just a self-seeking, inward-turning trip. It's not just another variation of the narcissistic fix, which is the sickness of our civilization, the pathology of the Piscean age, and has been lingering on for 2,000 years now. In fact, the Psychonautic Adventure, the Path of Illumination, is the cure, probably the best cure, and maybe the only sure cure against this disease of self-concern and narcissism.
In fact, what I'd like to say from my experience with psychonautic substances and the psychedelic experience is that from my personal experience, I recommend not to seek the self from inside the psychedelic experience. When I first took these substances, I was extremely mixed up and very wounded, and myself, my ego, the persona that I live with, was extremely confused by this experience. And I came to a time where I became sober, and I did extensive self-work, self-help work on myself to come to know myself, the persona that had been constructed in the years I had been here. And it's only when I came to know that self, after many years of sobriety, that I experienced these substances again. And so I want to say very strongly that I recommend the utmost sobriety, and I recommend the highest knowledge of self in order to go into that journey. Because if you're not mixed up in yourself, then you can turn outward to the wonder of the world.
Yes, perhaps one way you could state the paradox here is that you have to know yourself and know the conditioning that makes you have a self in order to go from there into the experience beyond self. I would characterize the psychonautic and psychedelic journey as a journey beyond self. And as you know, if you've read my book, Not in His Image, the people have heard us talking about it on the other discussions, I make a huge point, and I take a stand here that perhaps looks rather odd and disputable to some people, but I take that stand because I wholly and passionately believe it to be true. That is, that the full-blown ecstatic mystical experience does not lead to a sense of the divine self at all. It leads to a not-self, beyond self, in which you merge ecstatically with all that is. And so these are criteria, these are kind of guidelines. I mean, we're not lawgivers here, and we're not laying down the law, and we're not authorities. We're just people who have had a certain amount of time on the road in this adventure and are trying to offer what these are the guidelines that I myself use in order to stay sober and safe in this experience. And anyone else is welcome to use them as they like, you know. There's one other, while we're on this subject, is very briefly, there's one other criteria, one other element of the psychonautic journey that I would like to point out. And this will lead directly into the story material. It's an assisted trip. Now, many people would raise the question, well, if we're talking about the ultimate mystical or spiritual experience for the human being, why can't we just have it, you know, without any assistance? Why can't we just have it out of our own ability, or through some yoga practice, or through some type of meditation or training? Well, perhaps you can. I wouldn't absolutely deny that some people have had it in that way. But I'm not talking about those kind of mystical experiences. I'm talking about the one that involves the humility to allow yourself to be shown the path beyond self by another species, and by a plant ally. So these are the sacred teachers that have been provided to us by nature herself, by Gaia. They are Gaia's emissaries, and they are the mushrooms, they are the iboga, the ayahuasca, and the sacred plants that show us how to be human in ways that we ourselves cannot know. And if you don't have the humility to accept that, well, that's fine. I would never argue the case on anyone. But I have found that that humility is an essential ingredient in this adventure.
Well, while you were saying that, I was thinking about humility, and for me it's the humility to experience wonder and awe, and wonder and awe are by experience, by my experience, are not a self experience. Wonder and awe to me is definitely rooted in the selfless, and I cannot see anything outside of myself if I am trapped in myself.
Right. So this is why I've emphasized in my book that the nature of initiation in the ancient mysteries, which used psychedelic substances like ergot, was ego death and rapturous immersion in nature. And that is really the essence of the path we're talking about. Now, you just mentioned a moment ago, Joanna, that your trip to Mexico for the Marian Institute, which was linked to the 13 grandmothers, and I'd like you to tell us a little more about that in a moment, pretty much coincided with the 50th anniversary of a very significant event. And I'd like to tell our listeners what that event was, in case some of them don't know. A most amazing thing happened in May of 1957 in the United States, and that was that the issue of Life magazine came out. Now, I don't even know if Life magazine is published anymore in the United States. I guess it isn't, but during the years, the post-war years that Life was published, it was absolutely the most mainstream, conventional magazine that you could possibly imagine. And it dealt with all kinds of very ordinary subjects. But lo and behold, in the May issue of the 1957 Life, the feature story was about the journey into the heart of Mexico and the adventure of magic mushrooms, of experiencing a trance state and a visionary state through the ingestion of magic mushrooms. And the man who wrote this article was called R. Gordon Wasson. He was actually a New York banker, strangely enough. And the whole story, like Bill Wilson, right. And the whole story of the Psychonautic Adventure is actually a fantastic chapter in the history of our time. It's not just a chapter in American culture, but it very soon became global. Now, you might be astonished, or maybe you're not. I'm astonished that this article was published in Life magazine, and I'm not surprised that many people have said that Wasson's article, which was illustrated, showed Maria Sabina, showed him ingesting magic mushrooms, gave his first-hand description of the all-night vigil and so forth, that all of that put out in that issue was actually what exploded the psychedelic revolution of the 60s. This has been claimed. Now, Wasson himself was a shy and reticent man. He was a scholar as well as being a businessman, and he was rather ambiguous, or I guess you should say ambivalent, throughout his life about the fact that he might have triggered this incredible counterculture phenomenon. But the fact is that article probably did it. So we are now today sitting 50 years ahead in time from that article. And what I would like to try to describe as briefly as possible is what the premises of the adventure were as it was founded in Wasson's time, and how that has moved along today. In these 50 years, there's been a tremendous advance from what Wasson did. When he started out, there were other people as well who were experimenting with mescaline and LSD, most notably Aldous Huxley, Alan Watts, and Robert Graves. And these were intellectuals of the era of the Second World War and after the war. And through one connection or another, they became aware of something that was taboo and had been repressed and lost in our cultural history. They became aware that the primary religious experience of many indigenous peoples involved the ingestion of mind-altering plants. And it's really fantastic now to sit back after 50 years and look back in time, kind of telescope back in time, and think, well, gee, we're beginning to understand this today. To many people, this is we understand this, taken for granted. But just imagine those small group of people who rediscovered this. And Wasson is very important because Wasson formulated it in an intellectual idea, in a concept, which I call the Wasson thesis. And you can read about that on metahistory.org. It's in the lexicon, for instance, and I talk about the Wasson thesis in my book. What is the Wasson thesis? Quite simply, Wasson claimed, on the basis of his research into mushrooms, including the Amanita muscaria and the psilocybin mushrooms of Maria Sabina, Wasson claimed that the original religious experience of humanity, before religion was made into an institution and a dogma, was an ecstatic state of trance induced by the ingestion of mind-altering plants. That's the Wasson thesis. Now, I have looked at that thesis from many different angles, and since Wasson proposed it, many, many people have written books on it. For instance, one of the people who's currently writing today as a spin-off of the Wasson thesis is Professor Carl Ruck from Boston, who is a close friend of Albert Hoffman and so on. So Ruck's work, Terence McKenna's work, Ralph Metzner, who is still going, the great psychonaut veteran who bridges all these generations, all of these people are working off and developing various aspects of the Wasson thesis. And so that is really the germ or kernel of the psychonautic adventure. You could say that the adventure is to return to the religious experience of humanity that we had before we had religion. To the primitive, indigenous, primordial, nature-based, Gaia-oriented ecstasy of knowing.
How did Gordon Wasson, the straight banker Gordon Wasson, come to that thesis from ingesting psilocybin mushrooms with Maria Sabina?
Well, actually he didn't. The way that Wasson came to that thesis was by his research. And when he ingested the mushrooms with Maria Sabina, it validated what he had already seen in his research. There are now beginning to appear certain books that are describing this whole 50-year progression, starting with the Wasson thesis. As often happens with powerful cultural phenomena, it takes some generations, the second or third generation, before we begin to evaluate it. And in this evaluation of how Wasson came to this, we're beginning to understand how it all came together. First thing, I think it's very important to point out that Wasson got two clues from two people who were supremely positioned to direct him here. One was from Robert Graves, who himself was a poet and mythologist, a devotee of the goddess, living on the island of Majorca, eating magic mushrooms. And Robert Graves wrote to Wasson and clued him on to the idea of a, quote, mushroom cult. The other clue came from Maria Gimbutas, who was the great Lithuanian archaeologist and scholar who reintroduced the world to the goddess religions of ancient Europe that pre-existed civilizations, the great civilizations. And so you could say that Wasson, as an intellectual and a seeker and a kind of dilettante really, was extremely lucky in that he was able to receive 2 clues from these fantastically well-positioned people. But Wasson himself formulated the idea of the basis of religion through his investigations of the Amanita Muscaria and through reading the Vedas. For instance, he was deeply impressed by the fact that there are 108 passages in the ancient Vedas of India, which are the oldest recorded religious writings that we have, except for Egypt. 108 passages which speak of Soma, the divine plant that produces the divine intoxication of the Vedic priests. And so that was really planted the idea in Wasson's mind that wait, somehow true religion, which is to say ecstasy of seeing God, not dogmas, not beliefs, the direct ecstasy of seeing God is connected with the ingestion of some mysterious plant. Okay? So that's what planted the idea in his mind. And I think, Joanna, that he went to Mexico in order to experiment and to subject himself to that experience to see how it actually played out for him.
All right. There is a lot to say about this, and a couple of days ago, John and I have decided that we are going to do a series after this one where we will speak extensively about the psychedelic entheogenic experience from both an intellectual point of view and a personal point of view. For the purpose of this interview, I want to ask John, how does this all relate to coevolution?
Well, it seems to me that at the 50-year mark, we need to look both back and ahead. Those of us who want to even just inform ourselves about ecstatic religion and the worldwide tradition of ingesting sacred plants, just inform ourselves, not even do the plants, not even do the rituals, have an obligation to know this story and learn this story. Ralph Metzner, who is one of the great psychonautic veterans, who is now still teaching and still initiating and exploring this path with people in his group sessions that he does, wrote a book on the sacred mushroom, and in the first chapter of that book is a 40-page introduction, which really tells this whole story from Huxley and Wasson right down to Terence McKenna and right down to today. So looking back over the last 50 years, anyone who is interested in this, because of its supreme religious value, or because they might want to enter into this path, I believe has an obligation to know and learn the story and learn the facts of the story, because there are places in the last 50 years where the whole operation veered in various directions and started to go off track. For instance, Wasson himself thought that Timothy Leary was taking the whole operation off track, and he objected to having been associated in any way with Timothy Leary. But on the other hand, you could say, well, Timothy Leary was just logically carrying out to the public the information that Wasson had developed, you see?
Well, here. Yeah, I have a lot to say about that, but right now I would say that Timothy Leary was the mainstream whistleblower of that experience, and it makes a lot of sense that a psychologist, he was a scientist, and his branch of science was psychology. And so this goes back to what we were saying 20 minutes ago, which is that in his understanding of psychology, once you had understood your own psychology, then you would go further into the spiritual experience. And he saw that coming. Of course, he was ahead of his time. He saw that coming, and he blew the whistle on it. He just spoke about it widely, and it was misinterpreted, and you and I will talk about that in the series.
one of the problems that we become aware of as we look back over the 50 years is that quite early on, only some 10 years after the Wasson thesis, or the article appeared and Wasson's books became cult items, only some 10 years after that we were deep into the 60s, and quite soon at that point the essential element of the sacred and religious character of this experience was already becoming extremely blurred. So I would say that what happened already in just the first 10 years of the story was that the sacred dimension of the experience and the recreational dimension of the experience went their separate ways. And for many, many people, the taking of magic mushrooms, the ingestion of these plants and of LSD, which is a synthetic form of a plant, was experienced as a recreational entertainment rather than as a sacred path of knowing God, knowing the divine. And so this is a huge issue, and I consider this to be an unresolved issue today. And one of the things that I attempt to do whenever I talk about this subject is to draw a distinction between what I call the sacramental use of psychoactive plants and the recreational use.
Again, at this juncture, I want to say that, in my opinion, one of the problems of the 60s was that you had a whole generation of abused, narcissistic children born from numb parents who had gone through 1 or 2 wars, processing their psychological content through these entheogens, and not geared towards the psychological content blocking the spiritual way.
Yeah, that's a very helpful observation, Joanna, and we've discussed this for hours and days on end, of course. The generation of the 60s really blew open the gateway into the Psychonautic Adventure, but at the same time as they charged through that gateway, storming heaven.
It was about suffering.
It was about suffering.
Unresolved suffering, instead of being about an ecstatic part.
Right. They brought, as they moved into the adventure, they brought their unresolved suffering, their narcissism, all the harm of our harm from our bad parenting, and all that conditioning was loaded on to this experience, which in a sense is beyond all that and is not meant for a therapeutic processing experience. So that is one reason, by the way, I just point this out, why the word entheogen was formed, because Carl Rock and Jonathan Ott, who was a young colleague of Wasson, and Albert Hoffman and that group of core psychonauts objected to the word psychedelic, because it was connected with Leary, it was connected with the counterculture, it was connected with the whole problem of drugs in America. And so in order to separate their thesis from that, they invented the word entheogen instead of, they invented the word entheogen instead of psychedelic.
Say what the entheogen means.
An entheogen is a word that consists of 2 parts. Gen, which means generating, and entheo, which means the divine within. So it means that which generates the divine within. I would point out, however, that it generates the sense of the divine that is within us, but it does not mean that the divine is simply within us. So that's a bit of a nuance there that's important. So now I'd like to move ahead to your question, Joanna, which relates to the title of this talk, now that we're at the 29th minute. How does this all relate to coevolution? Well, if you look over the last 50 years since the idea of psychonautic experience was born out of the Wasson thesis, you find that there have been 2 parallel developments which are extremely enhancing. They help us not only understand how to properly assess this experience, but I think they provide us with many, many guidelines to correctly go on the path of experimental mysticism, as I call it. One of these is that from the early 60s onward, and especially through the 80s and 90s, there's been a huge explosion of books about shamanism, indigenous shamanic practices around the world, from the use of iboga in Gabon to the ayahuasqueros of Peru and the Amazon, back to the Siberian shamans, and all of this information about shamanism we didn't have in 1965 and 1968, and even until like early 1970s. This is extremely valuable in helping us not only to evaluate the psychonautic experience, but also to position ourselves in that experience. Secondly, what has come to light in the last 30 years, again starting in the early 70s, is an understanding of Gaia and the concept of coevolution. We didn't have that in the 60s either. We had a sense of love for the earth and kind of the sense of wanting to return to nature. And many of the people who were taking psychedelics or mushrooms at that time, or peyote or whatever, obviously had experiences of awe and wonder in the presence of nature. But we did not have the conceptual framework that we have now regarding Gaia, the living planet, and the concept of coevolution, meaning that we are not some unique species that is meant to dominate the earth by our intelligence, that we are not some privileged species of God who can do whatever we like with the natural world because we're following the rules of an off-planet father. We are in fact animals with a very special capacity of mind, and the challenge is for us to co-evolve our mind with the mind of nature. Now, this fantastically beautiful concept has only become defined and substantiated in the last 30 years. And what I see now, as we turn from looking back to where this began to looking ahead, I would like to ask this question: is it possible that the practice of experimental mysticism and the practice of psychonautics could be a discipline and an art that would teach us coevolution, or in which we would actually teach ourselves coevolution, or in which we would give ourselves to the plant teachers who would show us the secrets of coevolution? So what I'm proposing is that the concept of coevolution gives a focus and a direction to the psychonautic adventure.
And what I'm proposing is that illumination, not enlightenment, but illumination, receiving light about something, receiving understanding about something, means that you have to abandon your ego and put yourself inside the understanding of something that is not you, such as a leaf, an animal, and so on. And so if you surrender to the plant, the iboga, the mushroom, and we're not talking about marijuana, by the way, and we'll explain that in other talks. And we're not talking about hashish, and we're not talking about alcohol either. But if you surrender to the plant, to these particular plants, you then go within them and see from their perspective. And that is the useful way to experience coevolution.
I was just talking yesterday to a friend of mine here in Spain about how these things work and what is it that we actually do. She asked me, when we ingest these plants and when we allow this other species actually to enter into our body and to enter into communication with us. And I said, you know, the mind is a wonderful instrument. It's a wonderful thing to have a mind, and obviously the human mind is kind of unique in the animal world. We can do a lot of damage with it, but it's a beautiful instrument by which we can accomplish things that other animals cannot. But just imagine that you could take your mind and momentarily give it to another being who even knows how to use it better than you do. This is actually what happens when we allow ourselves to have interspecies communication with the entities that live in these psychoactive plants. We momentarily surrender our ego and we allow them to do things with our minds that we could not do, and then we learn in that way. So this is an essential way of characterizing coevolution. What you just said, Joanna, about giving yourself to that which is other than you, be it the leaf, the cloud, the deer, the horse, the whale, and that is a way of describing the path of coevolution. In my book, Not in His Image, I made a case which I believe to be true, and I believe it to be historically accurate, although no one apparently has made this case until now, but the historical evidence is there. The case I made is that the ancient pagan mysteries of Europe involved a practice of sacred instruction dedicated to the great goddess, the Magna Mater, whom we call Gaia, and whom the Gnostics call Sophia. So when those Telestae and those mystics in the pagan schools, whether they were the Druids of Scotland and Ireland and Wales, whether they were the initiates of Syria and Egypt, the Greek initiates, whoever they were, when they went into visionary trance induced by sacred plants, they did it with a telos, a specific purpose. The purpose was to be instructed in the ways of nature in a manner that we cannot achieve through our own intellectual processing. We can do fantastic things, but there is a limit. I personally don't believe that we can achieve coevolution with Gaia through rational thinking alone. I think that rational thinking and the visionary experience go together. They are not in any way contradictory, but we need to make that extra step, and that is why it is an assisted trip. We can't make that step. The ego cannot undo the ego. It has to be undone by something else. So I have I feel great encouragement and inspiration in the thought that we stand at a tremendous threshold in our species evolution right now. And the last 50 years have brought us to that threshold. The introduction of the Watson thesis up until now would be considered, if you talked about it in the university, if you went into any university or any school, it would seem to be a minor thing, something that happened in the course of the 20th century, and a certain countercultural movement developed around it. I don't believe that. I believe that the Watson thesis was the catalyst to really the greatest spiritual awakening that our species can undergo at this time. And that awakening, however, is a responsibility of the people who take it on. It's not just going to happen. It has to be preserved and cherished and practiced, as Joanna says, with sobriety, with humility, and with discipline.
And also, this is where the concept of Sangha, which in the Buddhist sense means spiritual community, this is where the concept of community, true community, is extremely important. I strongly believe that we cannot learn on our own. This is why certain classrooms, like the mystery classrooms, certain classrooms were very important, are very important. We have to learn together. And so we need support and true disinterested love. Now, we need to be passionately interested in each other's stories so that there is no loneliness in the psychological part of ourselves. But we definitely need community or sangha to practice these things.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end this talk. It's a little longer than we've usually done, but it's been a great joy to talk about this subject. And what you just said, Joanna, brings us back, of course, to the founding premise of Future Primitive. It's about communities, emergent communities, and it's about the rediscovery of the true group spirit and true tribal spirit in the future. And I totally agree with you. The one thing that is so sadly missing and tragically missing in our world, it's not family values, which the conservative monsters are always shoving in our face. It's community. Community is not about family and blood. It's about friendship, love, instruction, sharing, and I believe that coevolution depends on cellular communities, and I would like to think, in the wildest of my imagination, that they are springing up as I speak.
Thank you, and we'll be with you next time. To define the term psychonaut.
Well, that's a good place to start, because if we're going to talk about the Psychonautic Adventure, we need to know what psychonauts are. And of course the word is easy to analyze. Psycho is from psyche, meaning the mind, soul, or imagination. The animated part of every living creature is the psyche. And naut means someone who navigates, a sailor, a voyager, a pathfinder. So a psychonaut is someone who travels in the realms of the psyche. And you might also call such a person an entheonaut, because this word entheogen has been introduced. And we'll explain, or we'll discuss a little bit later, why the term entheogen was brought into use, and as opposed to the term psychedelic, which you and I are both quite familiar with, having been baptized in the Great Revolution of the 60s. So,
Well, hello, all you good listeners to futureprimitive.org. We are back for talk number 4, John Lash and Joanna Harcourt-Smith. This one is called the Psychonautic Adventure and the Path of Coevolution. So, I spoke about one of my latest adventures in the Psychonautic Adventure, which was last year when I went to Huautla in Mexico, in the Mazatec Mountains, and it was quite extraordinary because my visit there coincided with the 50th anniversary of the first time that Gordon Wasson was there and experienced the mushroom journey with Maria Sabina. So I'm going to ask John.
As we talk more about this adventure, I think it will become clear that it isn't not just a self-seeking, inward-turning trip. It's not just another variation of the narcissistic fix, which is the sickness of our civilization, the pathology of the Piscean age, and has been lingering on for 2,000 years now. In fact, the Psychonautic Adventure, the Path of Illumination, is the cure, probably the best cure, and maybe the only sure cure against this disease of self-concern and narcissism.
In fact, what I'd like to say from my experience with psychonautic substances and the psychedelic experience is that from my personal experience, I recommend not to seek the self from inside the psychedelic.
I want to point out one thing before we talk about what the adventure is. When we think about psychonauts and wonder who the great psychonauts of the 20th century were, for instance, the word, by the way, was introduced by a man called Ernst Junger. We need to understand perhaps who these people were by names, like Alan Watts, for instance, and by example, and by the way that they handled the psychonautic experience, we can learn from their example. But it's important to bear in mind that the psychonautic experience, the psychedelic experience, if you want to call it that, is not a journey inward. It's often been described in this way, and I'd like to point out that I think that description is misleading. The psyche, in fact, in my understanding, is not something inside us. It's more like something that we are inside. Just think about that. You are inside your own psyche. You're inside your psyche like the pupa of a butterfly is inside a cocoon. And the psyche that surrounds you is the medium of transformation in which you grow and evolve. So, my conception of exploring the psyche does not mean we shut our eyes and we go inside to some mysterious inner space. There is no inner space. There is just space. There is the space of matter and the space without matter. And the journey of the psychonaut is as much going out as it is going in. Certainly it does produce certain insights and realizations when we look into ourselves. But the essence of the journey, I believe, is to go outward into nature and into the soul of the world and explore nature and the mysterious, miraculous life of nature, which is the matrix of where we come from. So